For our second speaker, Romain Brethes is professor en chaire supérieure, classe préparatoire aux grandes écoles au lycée Janson de Sailly in Paris, as well as adjunct professor at Sciences Politiques. He has held numerous visiting positions at UCLA and NYU, at Cambridge, UK, at the University of Cape Town, at the University of Thessaloniki, at the École Française d'Athènes. He is the author of numerous works, most notably De l'idéalisme au réalisme, une étude du comique dans le roman grec, published in 2007, Celebrity, riche, célèbre et antique, with Laure de Chantal in 2010. And he is the editor, together with Jean-Philippe Guez, of a monumental volume, Roman grec et latin, translations into French of all the major novels of antiquity in both Greek and Latin, with a very substantive introduction. So many and more articles and chapters, such as Clitophon lecteur d'Ovide, question mark in 2014, How to be a Man towards a sexual definition of the self in Achilles Statius's novel Leucippe and Clitophon in 2012, always in 2012, Hommes sacrés, sacrés hommes, sacrés hommes, fonction du prêtre dans le roman grec, et Un drôle d'amant, I love your titles, among other things, Romain, in a collective volume edited by Sandra Boranger and Violaine Sébillotte-Cuchet, whom Thornton has just quoted. In 2011, the collective volume Hommes et Femmes dans l'Antiquité grecque et romaine, le genre, méthode et document. Romain is also a regular contributor to the magazine Le Point. Please join me in welcoming Romain Brethes, talking to us about softness today.
Thank you, Julia. Can you see my PowerPoint on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And we're actually ahead of our schedule, so you can really take your time and we can discuss.
Yes, I have to apologize. It's my fault. I hope that questions that would have been asked about the Artemisia paper have not been sacrificed. We can find a moment to go back to Artemisia. Please forgive me, Thornton. I'm so concerned about being punctual in Zurich that I went ahead of myself. So, but for the time being, Romain, nous vous écoutons.
Thank you, Julia. This small paper is entitled Men Can Be Soft in the Ancient World, the case of the novel, but it could have been entitled Forget About Virility for a While and Try a Little Tenderness. Tenderness or softness, or in Greek, malakia, is at the exact opposite of andreia, the main quality, which is valorized in classical Greece and particularly in Athenian democracy, as Julia luminously expressed it in Le Pouvoir des Femmes. I quote her. Il s'agit ici de comprendre la logique interne d'une culture politique. Cette culture politique valorise une vertu particulière, le courage, ou plus précisément, la virilité. There is a natural deficiency in women that prevents them from acting or deliberating in the political space, according to some anthropological and physiological standards, like those exposed in Aristotelian ethics. The very condition of Athenian democracy is masculinity, and virility is their fundamental virtue. A ruler, or even a citizen, has to control his emotions and to show his thumos and to avoid the suspicions of dahlia and malakia, in a word of effeminacy, all these deviances that threaten his position and self-representation in the city. These obsessions and anxieties do not disappear even after many centuries, when the political life, so still active in the Greek world of Hellenistic and imperial times, may perhaps not display the same vitality as in the classical times. But the rise of sophistic movements, whether we name it second sophistic or not, the intensification of declamatory style, the opening of some chairs of rhetoric reflect a matrix of competitions and highly agonistic contests in the main urban centers of Roman Empire. But even in this new picture, the Andrea prevails more than ever. So it may have slowly moved away from the civic assemblies or the battlefields to the stages of amphitheaters, where the sophistic masters coming from Gaul, Spain, Africa, or Asia Minor exhibit fireworks of artistic, cultural, and literary skills. But the recipe proposed by Julia remains the same. To reach a good level of Andrea, you need muscles, you need blood, and you need heat. And to reach this level, like in the video games, you have to erase all the signs of effeminacy, like a high-pitched voice, the gesture of a hand, a dubious walk, or the use of certain lexical or grammatical features. In this short paper, I would like to focus on the expression, contestation, and reconfiguration of Andrea in a hybrid literary produce stemmed from the sophistic ecosystem of the 1st century CE. In the Greek novel, a young couple of Aegenes, elites or well-born, fall in love at first sight, a perfectly symmetric love, and despite several attempts against their chastity by other suitors, they are expected to remain pure and faithful until the end of the adventures, a happy ending, of course. While this monolithic setting is twisted by many noticeable exceptions, the Greek novel is a place where the polarity between the masculine and the feminine may be questioned and even seriously blurred by the novelists who would express, according to some famous Foucauldian views, an ideological change in the representation of reciprocal love and fidelity. This change also affects the self-positioning of male characters in the novel, who have to adapt and sometimes modify their own bodily axis, according to the Aristotelian definition, reminded by Julia in her book. In the Greek novel, you make love rather than war. And when you make war, it's generally because you want to make love. Andrea is almost always conceived in its connection with Eros rather than warfare. I will first explore, as shortly as possible, the adaptation of Andrea to the novelistic realities in Carrington's Callirhoe, a novel of the so-called pre-sophistic area, before turning to a celebration of softness in L'Occupé and Clitophon, probably the most challenging novel in terms of gendered ambiguities. But let's now travel to the Syracuse of the end of the 5th century BC. Callirhoe, the pride of all Sicily, is a beautiful daughter of the general Hermocrates, who gloriously defeated the Athenians on sea, an infamous moment for the Athenian democracy and a crucial symbol of its inexorable decline. She fell in love with a surpassingly handsome Chaereas, and they get married, although their parents were first inclined, because of civic rivalries, to reject this union. But Eros intended to make a match of his own, and there is no such force as Eros you can compete with in Greek novels. But some jealous suitors of Callirhoe decide to plan a trick to shame the girl and break off the wedding. After the failure of their first attempt, their leader, the tyrant of Agragas, imagines a second plot. He will convince Chaereas that Callirhoe is adulterous. With the help of a lover seducing Callirhoe's maid, the tyrant produces a tragicomedy in miniature, where Chaereas, hidden in the dark, witnesses the coming of his wife's alleged lover. And this is the first text of my, that you can see on the, you can see on the screen. So when night fell, Chaereas went to keep watch, and the man who had seduced Callirhoe's maid darted into the lane. He adopted the manner of a man who wanted to keep his business secret, but in fact did everything he could to be noticed. His hair was gleaming and heavily scanted, his eyes were made up, he had a soft cloth and fine shoes, heavy rings gleamed on his fingers. The description of this moikos fits with the expected semiotics of gender regarding Greek standards. With his gleaming hair, his fine shoes, his rings, and his soft cloak, imation malakon, he exhibits hypersensuality and effeminacy, which are the common features of a very well-known creature pointed out by some physiognomonic treatises, the Kinaidos, and Julia mentions the fascinating figure in Le Pouvoir des Femmes. As expected, Chaereas is overwhelmed by rage and anger. He runs into the house and kicks Callirhoe into her belly. She faints, is thought to be dead, and she is buried in a splendid mausoleum. Some pirates open the vault at night, discover Callirhoe alive, and decide to sell her as a slave in Caria, where she is bought by Dionysius, the most educated man in the city of Aphrodisias. It is the beginning of endless and erratic adventures that led Chaereas to Babylon, where he faces two rivals, the gentleman Dionysius and the king of Persia himself. When he believes Callirhoe to have been awarded to Dionysius by the king, Chaereas is persuaded by his fellow Polemarchus that they should avenge this humiliation and die as heroes. In the book 7 of Callirhoe, there is a noteworthy increase in the use of Andrea, since Chaereas makes an autonomous decision to put himself in the firing line, and I quote here Muriel Jones in her book about masculinity in Greek novels. First, he offers his help to an Egyptian in his revolt against the Persian troop. This is the text 2, where he says, we have the two strongest possible motives for acting bravely, duota protepticotata eis Andreian e contes. We passionately want to die, and we passionately want revenge. Then he picks up 300 warriors and he flames the tumults of his companion in the battle. And this is the text 3. On the other hand, the navy's morale rose high, and they were filled with fighting spirit at the thought of having the bravest and finest of men as their commander. Otiton Andreiotaton, kai Kaliston, Ekon, Egumenon. Captains, helmsmen, crew, marines all set out eagerly to see who could be the first to display to Chaereas its zealous devotion. Tis protumian epidexetai Chaerea protos. Zealous devotion translates protumia, a word which states the impulse of any soldier who wants to defend his individual freedom, according to Herodotus. Les citoyens très démocratiques, pleins d'une fougue qui les pousse à aller de l'avant, deviennent alors les meilleurs des guerriers, and I quote Julia here. It is hard, of course, not to make the parallel between Chaereas' brave soldiers and the Athenian citizens fighting Xerxes' troops on the sea at Salamis. Callirhoe herself stands among the prisoners made by Chaereas' army, and she feels despaired as she ignores the identity of her new master. She is urged to take courage by an Egyptian soldier who describes Chaereas without naming it with the following words, and this is the text 4. Do not be afraid, my lady. At present, the admiral does not know that you two have been shut up here with the prisoners. But when he finds out, he will look after you kindly. He is not only brave, humonos garandreios, but he will make you his wife, gunaika poiesestai. He has a liking for women, phuseigar esti philogunaios. Even if the text is slightly corrupted here, there is a clear association between the Andreas that Chaereas displays at warfare and his natural dispositions towards women as philogunaios. Chaereas demonstrates an Andrea controlled by his paideia, suggesting that he has not learned how to behave towards women, that he don't have to, and he cannot kick them into the belly. Many commentators have underlined the echoes of Thucydides, Xenophon, or Isocrates in the transformation of Chaereas, now a character where the moral rectitude mixes with phronesis, good sense, and tarsos, courage. If we try to adopt the perspectives of Julia in her book and to decipher the political meanings of this transformation, it clearly appears that the author intended to make his hero compete with heroic figures like Themistocles, Leonidas, or even his father-in-law, Hermocrates, in terms of military and political abilities. The way he talks to the Syracusan assembly at the very end of the novel, where he is all contrition, reveals also the temperament of a forthcoming ruler. Hermocrates urges his likely successor to focus upon his deeds, and Chaereas gets empowered thanks to his military exploits, but also to his rhetorical and narrative skills and to his dispositions towards women. In the word of Cariton, political abilities, erotic passion, and martial contest are clearly inseparable. It is not surprising that this celebration of Andrea coincides with a progressive access to civic responsibilities in the case of Chaereas. For a long time, the birth of Greek novel has been justified by the decline of the classical city-state model. With the dissolution of political structures, the individual would have been more absorbed in himself and in his private life, which would have opened the path towards the novel. This reading has been ably nuanced by Tim Whitmarsh, who underlines that the first century romances that produced of a time of cautious hope in the Greek cities of Asia Minor, a tentative belief that communities can be reborn after struggles and sufferings. And this is particularly visible in Chariton, where the theme of post-conflict renaissance is strong. And if compromises need to be made, particularly with foreign power, and Persia in Chariton's novel being easily readable as a figure for Rome, the traditional values like Andrea that were operating in the process of ruling a city in classical times are still effective in the novel. But from the second century novels, the romance patterns shift radically, and Andrea makes no exception. In Chariton, or even in Xenophon of Ephesus, the polarity between the masculine and the feminine is not really contested by both authors, who need to illustrate the renewability of the urban community with stable and recognizable values, such as Andrea. The sexual symmetry, nicely defined by David Constant to characterize the erotic process in Greek novel, nonetheless delimitates new boundaries that the hero and the heroine cannot normally cross in any case. The first century novels carefully refuse to play the game of the hybridization of gender or the celebration of softness. However, men can be soft, and then can also be loved for that. And this celebration fits with the celebration of bodily fluidity, transformation, doubling, and inversion in Achilles Tatius' novel, Leucippe and Clitophon. Let's now move to the middle of 2nd century CE in Tyre, a splendid Phoenician city. Clitophon, the first-person narrative hero of the novel, coming from a wealthy family, desperately falls in love with her cousin, the beautiful Leucippe. But this coup de foudre cannot really be compared to those affecting the other lovers, such as Chaereas and Callirrhoe, precisely because we lack, due to the narrative focalization, Leucippe's reactions, which distorts the protocols of symmetrical love. While his father has other plans for him, Clitophon is willing to satisfy his own desire with Leucippe. Satyrus, one of Clitophon's praeceptor Amoris, encourages him with a metaphor depicting Leucippe's conquest as a war and Eros and Clitophon as soldiers. This is the text 5. My good friend, Eros admits of no feebleness. You observe the military nature of accoutrements, the bow, the quiver, the missile, the flame. All manly things, Andrea Panta, and crammed with courage. You are cowardly, Delos, and timorous with a god such as that inside you? In reaction, Clitophon takes up the same metaphor to put himself in the firing line. How long will your silence last, O man without manhood, an Andre? Why this cowardice in a soldier in the service of a manly god? Tide Delos et stratiotes, Andreu, teu. This exclamation clearly mimics an episode from Xenophon of Ephesus Ephesiaca, as it was well noticed by Ken the Tummerman, where Abrocomes regards his newly aroused love for Antia as a threat for his manliness. And this is the text 7. What catastrophe has befallen me, Abrocomes, still know a man, despising Eros and slandering the god? I have been captured and conquered, and I am forced to be the slave of a girl. No, it seems there is someone more beautiful than I am, and I acknowledge love as a god. But no, I am nothing but a worthless coward. O panta anandros ego kai poneros. In both cases, the emotional conflict is organized around the poles of courage, manliness, and cowardliness. But there is a huge difference between the two protagonists. Abrocomes considers it unmanly and morally reprehensible to give in to his passion, while unmanliness consists precisely in opposing his passion for Clitophon. This is confirmed by the verb andrizestai, which is used twice by Achilles Tatius in the text. The first occurrence takes place when Satyrus, against him, urges Clitophon to take advantage of Leucippe's apparent docility, and it's a text 8. After the banquet, Satyrus approached and said, "Now is the time to adust your manhood. Nun men andrizestai kairos." The girl mother, as you know, is unwell, egar meter tescores oidas malakizetai, and resting alone, and the girl will take her usual stroll before turning, etc. Translation of andrizestai here can vary. Tim Whitmarsh chooses here to hardest your manhood, while John Winkler prefers a suggestive, it is time to play the man, which fits with the performance that Clitophon displays all along the narrative. In this passage, Achillostatius wittily establishes an antithesis between Andrea and Malakia, between the sexual Andrea Satyrus expects Clitophon to show, and the Malakia, softness and weakness of Leucippe's ailing mother. But Malakia more usually indicates moral than physical weakness, and the reader versed in the erotic code of the genre knows that it will be Clitophon who will show such Malakia should he sleep with Leucippe before they are lawfully married. The second occurrence appears at a key moment of the drama, after having flew from Tyre and endured several threats to their lives. Clitophon and Leucippe have joined an army ready to fight the Boukoloi, the terrifying Egyptian brigands living along the Nile. And this is the text 9. I was billeted with Leucippe in her house a little way beyond the general's quarters. When I entered, I grabbed her into my arms, trying to put my manhood to use. Oyos teemen andrizestai. Given the military context, with the special proximity of generals' quarters and the preparations for war, Achillostatius clearly mocks Clitophon's disposition to show off his Andrea in erotic action, much better than on the battlefield. In Achillostatius, masculinity is not an obvious given. The forms of subjectivity that Clitophon experiences in his own body and gender are visible through two puzzling parallels I would like briefly to focus on before concluding. When still in Tyre, in order to seduce Leucippe, Clitophon compares himself to Heracles. Truly a judicious choice, since the mythical hero is an honorable emblem in late antiquity. But he selects not the brilliant warrior of literary tradition, nor the austere stoic figure put on stage by Seneca, but the effeminate and cross-dressed Heracles subjugated to Omphale, the queen of Lydia. And this is the text 10. While I was indulging this dialogue, I failed to notice that I was standing next to the girl who had approached unseen. On seeing her, I immediately turned pale and then scarlet. She was alone. Not even Clio was with her. Even so, I found myself dazed and incapable of speech. Greetings, mistress, I said. She smiled sweetly, and her smile was a coded signal that she had understood why I had said, greetings, mistress. I, you mistress, don't say that. Why not? After all, a certain one of the gods has sold me into servitude to you, as Heracles was sold to Omphale. Are you referring to Hermes? It was to him that thus entrusted the sale of Heracles. She said this with a laugh. You might have recognized on the screen the Gustave Courtois painting that illustrates the cover of Julia's book, and that she comments through the lens of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in very suggestive pages of her book. This episode has been the object of much comic exploitation, especially by Ovid in his elegiac poems like the Fasti or the Eredes. Another cross-dressing episode also attests to Clitophon's less than masculine aspects. After another Leucippe's false death, Clitophon sails to Alexandria, where he meets a rich widow from Ephesus named Melite, who believes her former husband died in a shipwreck. Predictably, Melite falls in love with Clitophon and convinces him to marry her. Nevertheless, Clitophon refuses to have sex with Melite, pleading the spatial proximity of Leucippe's death. Leucippe is not dead, of course, it's a false death. Once they return to Ephesus, the situation totally changes. Melite's former husband, having come from the dead, accuses Clitophon and Melite of adultery. While Clitophon is jailed, covered with chains, Melite visits him. At least, they make love. And Clitophon becomes the moikos he was not yet literary. Melite then helps her lover to escape by dressing him in her own clothes. And this is the text 11 and my last text. Oh, sorry. With these words, she dressed me up as herself and kissed me. How much more handsome you have become with this clothing, she said. I once saw Achilles like this in a painting, but please take care, dearest, and keep this clothing as a memento of me, and leave yours for me, so that I may put it on and be enveloped by you. And she gave me 100 gold pieces. Melite then refers to a painting representing Achilles not as a great and manly Iliadic warrior, but as a young man dressed as a girl among Kid Lycomedes' daughter, hidden on Skyros by his mother Thetis. What is interesting for Achilles' transition to manhood is that this period of gender ambiguity occurs before he displays his military Andreia and becomes the best of the Achaeans at Troy. While the episode of Clitophon, cross-dressing in Leucippe and Clitophon, exactly coincides with Clitophon's presumed maturation as a miles amoris, maturation which consists of having sex and being a moikos under the patronage of Eros. We have then the paradigm of the two cross-dressed epic heroes, nonetheless valorized for asserting their masculinity, Heracles towards Omphale and Achilles towards Deidamia, both of them fathering sons during their stay. Heracles and Achilles' Andreia and virility are never really contested, even in these two episodes, while Clitophon's case remains problematic. For an educated reader, his inclination to pleasures and sensuality, his depiction as a reversible lover both by men and women, his taste for rhetorical flamboyance betray a scandalous gender trouble. To conclude very briefly, I have tried to suggest that how the polarity between Andreia and Malakia was problematized in different ways by Chariton and Achillestatius. While the former strengthens the sexual dichotomy due to a political and civic agenda mimicking the classical times, Achillestatius' performance reflects a fluid world, which, according to Tim Whitmarsh, transforms the Hellenocentric paradigms encoded in the first century texts by placing greater emphasis upon alterity, the mutability of identity, and I would add, a sometimes shameful and irresistible celebration of softness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A little applause. Many questions, I imagine. This narrative, not just placing the novel in the perspective of previous literature, but within the novelistic tradition, seeing a very important turning point and a profound transformation of the categories and the semantic fields and the experiences of Andreia, so manliness, courage on the one hand, and Malakia, softness and tenderness on the other. So thank you again very much, and the floor is open. Questions welcome, not only from classical scholars, but also from modern scholars, because these questions have a long history of reception and recontextualization and comment, and sometimes translations simply. So all the questions will be welcome. Any medieval echo?
Maybe I can start. I am not at all a specialist of the antiquity, but I was wondering, I also learned following Julia's class that actually male softness is quite well documented in antique text, which I wasn't aware of. And I was wondering if this is a continuous phenomenon that we can retrace through history up to our time, or if it's something that disappears and then reappears in recent years. Maybe too long of a period to just answer it like that, but I was wondering if you know anything about this.
I'm not the only one, I think, who could answer this question, and perhaps Julia will be perhaps more aware about this question. Which is important, as Julia said, is that the turning point of the first centuries is absolutely fundamental to understand. The ways masculinity defines itself compared to femininity or feminism pole. The polarity is still here. The polarity never disappears actually in the beginning of the first centuries. But clearly there's something coming on. You've got Michel Foucault who has, of course, wrote a lot about that in his Histoire de la sexualité. But which is interesting in the case of the novel is that you have really a kind of sexual symmetry between male and the male and the woman, and you have the same reactions, same emotional reactions in men and women, except that in the first century's novels, this dichotomy, is reinforced or is endorsed by the novelists, because you have something like an imitation of the classical times in the context of this novel. So you have, of course, the same way of thinking about masculinity and femininity, which is completely different in the following novels. Of course, Longus, Daphnis and Chloe is very interesting point. I didn't have the time, of course, to talk about, but you have a display of softness in Longus, which is absolutely fascinating, and Julia wrote about this. And in Achilles Statius, you have really a celebration of softness, which can remind something you can see, for example, in Roman elegy, clearly, where you have Propertius or Ovid, who claim the Mollis character, the soft character of their works, compared to the traditional military Andrea that you can observe, because Andrea is always related, or almost always related, to battlefields or to military area, and it's quite different with the erotic Passion or erotic Andrea that you can see in the novels or even in Roman elegy. And I think that's really a turning point to understand well, perhaps the gender trouble that occurs in the beginning of the first centuries, and there was a lot of consequences, of course, for the reading of this in the medieval times also, or Renaissance.
Thank you.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. What to say briefly? Well, softness can be good. It depends where and when. And let me expand on this. When we talk about the binary opposition of the female and the male in the context of, say, to start, Greek culture at large, we might be tempted in a more or less aware inclination to think within the tradition of structural analysis that we are talking about two concepts that really are one simply the contrary of the other. But very often when we read Hippocrates, to start, when we read even Aristotle, when we read Plato, and so on and so forth, we realize that this polarity is actually diluted and distributed on a spectrum, on a continuum in which you have degrees of femininity or masculinity. So I think that the Greeks had already invented the idea of what we call today the beyond the binary, because the binary is first of all a matter of qualities, male quality, female quality, that can be predicated and attributed and then can be transferred and circulate and can be somehow dosed, that can be measured out. So This is why, whereas as we will see, as I've tried to also to show in the book, as Romain argues, well, Andrea is good. Andrea is good, and Malakia is bad in the context of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, for instance. Yes, we agree. At the same time, if you have too much Andrea, you become so daring that you fight everything, including the waves of the sea, like the Celts. That's crazy. So it's not that any kind of Andrea and any quantity or intensity or tension of Andrea is equally good. So this is just to, in a sense, to give a background to this turning point Romain is talking about. Actually, the people who would write or listen or read those novels were prepared to think in a fluid manner, I think, very, very much so. But I couldn't agree more that if, as we do with Romain, if we think that Roman elegy can be seen in the background, as hypothetically as we can, speculate, can be seen in the background of the Greek novel, well, yes, you have narratives of the process of civilization where you start from a very rough and rigid masculinity, and what does it mean to undergo a transformation that brings human being to the urbs, to the space of the city. It means to discover voluptas, to discover sex, to discover women, and to be somehow contaminated by the softness of women. And so men are civilized by femininity, by the mixing up with women. And since it is a continuum, once again, they can go too far. So, as Ovid says, women, be careful, because a man who is too well dressed, too refined, the hair is adjusted in a way that is extremely detailed, well, that man might have more lovers than you. So you really have a sort of paradigm of a narrative of the process of civilization that goes from extreme masculinity to extreme effemination, going through the right period, the right time, the right space, the right cultus in which a man can be relatively urban. I see a hand.
Yeah, a real hand. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there's a really interesting question by René de Nicolet in the chat.
Yes,
and he cannot ask it orally because he's in a library. But
read it, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So I finished just 1 second to say yes, yes to everything, with a sense of the long duration of the trouble, between the two genders has always been there. I mean, this is not to be contrarian and to reject turning points, but I think that binarism has always been thought in a much smarter way by the ancient than we might think. I see one hand and one question in the chat. What can I do? Benjamin, do you mind if I read the question in the chat that was there before?
Yeah, I think he's okay.
Yes, yeah, it's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I can also read it if you want.
You can read it.
Yes, because I read it before.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The question is about the significance of the titles, if they are genuine, in relation to what we just said about polarity. What does it mean to name a novel after the main two characters, but starting with the female one?
It's an interesting question because I mean, it depends. Sometimes we have a few manuscripts of this novel. We have very few manuscripts, and they don't. I mean, sometimes you have the names of the two characters. What is interesting, for example, is about the title of Calire. Before the title, I mean, used to be, I mean, as in translation, Kaireas and Caliroi, but it changed definitely a few years ago because at the very end of the novel, with the Sfragis, Cariton said, "This is a story of Caliroi." This is a story of Caliroi, just at the very end of the novel. So clearly, I mean, the title, if there was a title, must have been Caliroi, only the name of the girl, actually. And Xenophon of Ephesia, there was two titles, the Ephesiaca or Antia and Abrochromes. And Heliodorus is the same, the Ethiopica or Chariclea and Theagenes. But it depends actually on the manuscripts we had, and we had very few manuscripts. But which is interesting, it's a kind of arbitrary choice, of course, in the translation of this title. But it was a choice. I mean, clearly determined by the idea that there was clearly a kind of sexual symmetry between the two heroes, and that the fact that the woman, for example, Caliroi, was really at the center of the narrative. So that's a very important point about that. Beyond the title, I mean, beyond the use of the title and the conventions of the title, but it is true that the place of the feminine in the novels, in the Greek novels, is absolutely outstanding compared, I mean, to Greek traditional standards, and we didn't have time, of course, to speak about Andrea in women in Greek novels, but there was sometimes a use of lexical uses of Andrea related to women in the Greek novels, which is quite interesting. So yeah, that's very good point.
Thank you, Romain. Benjamin.
Yeah, I was wondering this reconfiguration that you already see in Roman elegy, and then you see it in these novels. You mentioned briefly at the beginning, you know, that there's a sense, kind of an account. The polis has Andrea, and then there is a reconfiguration due to changed circumstances, due to changed historical context. Obviously, is this something you yourself subscribe to, or are you more? I also noticed actually in the chat there's this question that I think goes in a similar direction. I wasn't sure, do you yourself subscribe to that, or are you with Julia? There's no turning point really. Not trying to stir up any trouble, of course.
No, that's a good point, because I mean, I start from hypothesis by Julia's in her book, actually, about the classical use of Andrea defined by Aristotle, in of course in the dichotomy of male and female. As Julia said, there is a kind of different degrees, I think, of Andrea to Malakia. You're not all Andrea, you're not all Malakia. That's an interesting question, because I think with the first century there's a clear shift between the first novels and the novels of the second century, like Longus and Achillostatus. There's a clear shift in the definition of softness and in the valorization of softness, for example, in the heroic male protagonists. So that's something you cannot contest. And which is interesting is that Chariton locates his action in the classical Greece, actually, in the 5th century BC Greece. So the way he defines Andrea is both related to, I mean, the time he writes his own novel, the 1st century CE, but also in mirror to the 5th century CE. So there's a difference, I think, between this type of novel and the type of novel Achillostatius and Longus wrote, with, I think, a strong influence, and I'm trying to answer perhaps the question. Yes, but perhaps it's too long, Julia, no?
I think we should.
have now gone beyond by 1 minute, so this we can really come back to this question, also to a very interesting question in the chat that revolves around the very notion precisely of Malakia and Andrea. And I think that perhaps we can keep these questions and your replies, Romain, for the end, because the theme will re-emerge. So if it's okay, we can now
that would be great.
Move